Today's shipwreck video jumps forward in time quite a bit compared to the others. Most of the wrecks I've covered so far have been from the 1940s, with the notable exception, of course, of SMS Scharnhorst. This video will go in the other direction and jump ahead in time, right up to the 21st century as it turns out, to the last all-gun warship shipwreck, because by the time the ship was wrecked, most of those were gone. In any event, the wreck for today is the Soviet cruiser Murmansk, one of the last gun cruisers of the Soviet Navy, and a ship decommissioned with the end of the Cold War. Just another victim of the great drawdown of the Russian fleet. Although, in the case of this cruiser, she was one of the more unfortunate cases. Murmansk was sold to an Indian scrapping company in the early 1990s, specifically in 1994. This wasn't unusual in of itself. Indian scrapyards often snapped up ships, especially around this time. Things fell apart, however, in the process of towing the cruiser to India, because during the towing process, the cruiser ran aground. This happened off a sleepy Norwegian fishing village in the extreme north of the country. I'm not even going to try butchering that pronunciation, so I'll just put the name on the screen. That aside, Murmansk was a lost cause. While the ship had gone to the scrappers in decent enough condition, the combination of running aground and the rough weather left her stuck. Pictures from just after the ship ran aground show the cruiser resting on her side with half of the hull submerged. Pictures from later show the ship on more or less an even keel by contrast. Regardless, the cruiser spent the next 20 or so years silently rusting away. She became something of a local attraction, with urban explorers clambering aboard the rusting hulk. Not something that was particularly advisable, but people did it anyway. However, the ship was becoming something of an environmental hazard. Old fuel, asbestos, and other fun things were still aboard. The Norwegians, understandably, didn't really want that falling apart and spreading into their waters. As a result, in the late 2000s, a scheme was put together to salvage the ship. By that point, the cruiser was too far gone to be refloated and towed away, not even with repair work. So, instead, the company AFDCOM set about building a cofferdam. They would drain most of the water around the cruiser and break her up on the spot. The following pictures come from that demolition effort. The wreck was sealed and drained in 2012, and by 2013, she was gone. While the work was progressing, however, Murmansk was quite a sight. And since the ship wasn't a war grave, this is just an interesting scrapping to look at. To begin, we have the ship seen from the air before the work began. Murmansk looks like most shallow water shipwrecks at this point. The overall shape of the hull barely visible underwater, with the superstructure crumbling and rust red. What makes her unique at this point are her guns. Barring something going really wrong with a museum ship, this will be the last time anyone sees a shipwreck quite like this one. More detail is visible at a lower tide, like seen here. The hull seems broadly intact, although beneath the surface, the ship was falling apart. The arguably more interesting thing here are these secondary guns. These are poking out of the water, with the rest of the hull beneath the surface. A better angle on the superstructure comes from this picture when the cofferdam was under construction. Most of the electronic equipment is long gone, with the bridge barely recognizable. Although I believe you can see a fire control director poking out of the water towards the stern. I marked that with an arrow. However, nothing beats an up-close and personal look. Here you can see where the water line generally was because of the growth covering the metal. It's a very stark dividing line between the water line and the rusted bits above water. It also shows just how much was left aboard the ship. Even the light anti-aircraft guns were still aboard because the Russians saw no need to remove them. They remained in place right in front of the bridge as the ship fell apart around them. The next three pictures will wrap up the pre-scrapping looks. First, an angle from the surface and further out. This is just another look at the superstructure from a different perspective. The second picture, on the other hand, is from much closer in. Here you can see where rangefinders began to slump over, as well as a good look at her funnel, which actually held up pretty well, considering how long the cruiser was sitting there. The area at the base of the funnel seems a bit rougher, though, probably because of tidal action. It's also another good example of where the water line shifted with those tides. The third picture is similar, but from the other side of the ship. It gives a better look at the rangefinders and how wrecked the aft superstructure really was. Not much of note beyond that, however. With that covered, then, let's move on to the actual scrapping process. As the ship was drained and more of the hull was exposed, scrappers descended upon Murmansk. The first things to go were the light superstructure bits: the bridge, the funnel, and the rangefinders. As you can see from this set of images, it left the cruiser looking very bare, for lack of a better term. The bridge structure and bow turrets are gone in the first picture, leaving the bow very empty. It gives a good look at the hull lines, which are still elegant even in this state, but that's about it. What might be more interesting than the bare bow is the amidships area. I've put an arrow in where it looks like the hull is buckled and broke. I'm not sure if that's from the scrapping or from the 20 plus years of tidal action. If it was tidal action, it goes a long way towards explaining why there was no attempt to refloat the wreck. In any event, this image shows the scrappers working from the bow towards the stern. The stern turrets were still in place at this point as a result. That leads into the next two images, looking at the stern of the cruiser. It shows the missing superstructure in stark detail, where the aft pair of turrets remain as the last major piece above the waterline. From further out, these don't look terrible either. The same could be said for the hull, beyond the obvious rusting. Closer in, however, is a different story. In this picture, the condition of the turrets is much clearer. The super-firing one already had a visibly elevated middle barrel in the other pictures, but now you can see all three are at different elevations. There's also black staining running along the entire face of the turret. The number 4 turret, by contrast, looks mostly fine. Probably more striking, though, is the ruin of her hull ahead of the turrets. Most of it is gone by this point, with only remnants here and there still remaining. Even down below the waterline, the stripping has begun. The next picture, even closer in, just shows the detail of the turrets in better view, as well as a gaping hole in her stern decking. That said, before we look at later periods of the scrapping, I want to shift to the two internal pictures I was able to find. These are every bit as rough as you'd expect from a ship with most of her internals underwater for 20 years. Rusted out frames and structures abound. For all intents and purposes, the interior of Murmansk is unrecognizable. I couldn't tell you where these pictures come from because there's basically no identifying features. This second shot is probably from higher up in the ship, perhaps where that gaping hole in the stern was, but it's impossible to be sure from what is shown in this picture. It does look like this was taken as the scrappers cut into the hull, judging from the mud. With those being the only internal pictures I found, however, that just leaves a handful of other angles on the scrapping progress. First, a look at the twisted mess they made of her hull ahead of the aft turrets. It's apparent that the scrapping process went into the ship from the area they completely drained. This gradually tore up Murmansk as they moved from one side to the other, until, eventually, They broke the armor plates and hull on the side still in the water, while leaving things like anti-aircraft guns just wildly tilted and barely attached to the remnants of the hull. On the other hand, the next picture shows the other side of the same area. Murmansk, in this picture, is rapidly vanishing. While the stern is still largely intact, the bow has been almost completely cut away. The bow turrets are long gone, with only the remnants of their barbettes left aboard the ship. Probably the most interesting part of this picture, though, is one of her secondary mounts just jutting up on its lonesome. They cut away everything around it, but left the gun itself. Eventually, this process of scrapping towards the stern left only scattered steel ahead of the aft turrets. That's clearly visible here, with only about a third of the ship remaining. And then it gets worse when you have this ground level shot. That lonesome secondary gun is still there, as well as one of the aft turrets. But that's basically all there is, along with another secondary mount. Everything else is gone, leaving only twisted debris and mud. There's not a ship at this point, just ruined metal. It's a sad image if you like warships like Murmansk. However, it's also a natural thing for a ship. If she doesn't sink in deep water, or isn't lucky enough to be preserved, this is what happens. The scrapper's torch descending upon the ship. Murmansk simply stands out because of the undertaking that was necessary to scrap her, as shown here with the draining of her wreck. She was an interesting case of technical ingenuity, but in the end, she was scrapped like any other old warship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.